Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Unity Hour. For those of you who may be new to Unity Hour or the Mom Project in general, my name is Katie, and I am on the community team here at the Mom Project. The Mom Project is committed to building a better workplace for women, moms, and caregivers, and we do this by pushing for more equitable career opportunities and supportive workplaces. You may have noticed that we have taken a few weeks off from our Unity Hour programming. That's because the past few weeks and months and centuries, if we really want to get into it, have been overwhelming, challenging, heartbreaking, inspiring, enraging. From the devastating impacts of COVID-19 and its disproportionate impact on women and minorities, to the tragic deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, and that doesn't even fully include this week's news cycle. Catalyzing collective action against hatred and racism in America. A lot has happened to open people's eyes, minds, and hearts in new ways in recent months. At the Mom Project, we've been spending a lot of time listening to our community and exploring what we are doing as an organization. While we don't have all of the answers, we do know that it's our responsibility to make change, to build a better workplace. We are actively working to better prioritize, mobilize, and accelerate actions to advance underrepresented minorities. We're doing the work, and we will report back to you all on everything as we make meaningful progress. As always, we invite each and every one of you to contribute your voices to this conversation, and we'll provide opportunities to collaborate with you all. So please stay tuned for more from us on that front. We also want to acknowledge one unique thing about the Mom Project community that really leaves us feeling hopeful. We are moms, we are dads, we are caregivers. We are individuals that assume roles that require us to think beyond just ourselves and our own needs. We put others first. We look at things from a perspective outside of our own. That is powerful, and we need to leverage that mindset and mentality to push for racial justice and real change, not just for us, not just for our kids or our family or friends, but for everyone, starting right now. The changes we push for today and the things we fight for now will certainly be felt by us, but even more so by the next generation. And the thing is, we're the ones raising the next generation, from the tiniest infants to young adults who are getting ready to step out into the world on their own. We are the ones they look to and learn from. And that means it is up to us to nurture a future generation that is filled with leaders who are bold and just and fair. And that work starts at home. So to those of you who are here today, Juneteenth, thank you. Joining today's conversation is an important step forward as we all strive for racial justice. We are thrilled to have Britt Hawthorne here to lead today's session, anchored in anti-bias education at home. Britt is a nationally recognized anti-bias and anti-racist teacher educator. Her work seeks to move justice from being an idea to being the authentic culture. Britt is also the co-creator of the Instagram #Antiracist Book Club and the mom of 2 boys. We'll be answering community submitted questions during the last 15 minutes of today's session as time permits, and we encourage commitment to listening and learning during this session. Thank you all again for being here, and I'm really excited to introduce you all to Britt.
Thank you so much, Katie. I really appreciate the warm introduction, and hello to the Mom Project and the wider community. I'm honored to be here. As Katie said, I'm a nationally recognized equity trainer. I work with classroom educators across the country, really seeking to move this idea of what is anti-racist, anti-bias into authentic culture and into action. Personally, I am the mama of 2 boys, 13 and 7, and we call them artists. And I homeschool our youngest one as an act of resistance, and our oldest one goes to our local public school. And so we are intentionally creating an anti-bias, anti-racist home. And that's what I'm going to actually chat with y'all about today is how do you prepare a home environment that is in fact intentionally affirming our child's many identities, that is embracing differences, that is helping them to recognize what is unfair and what is bias. And then also, how do we help them to advocate for themselves and for their friends, for their neighbors, either individually or collectively. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. If y'all wanna just pop in the chat box and in the comments, just a hey, where you're calling in from, while I go ahead and share my screen. Today, we're going to talk about the 4 goals of anti-bias education for children. These goals go for children birth through 18. And so it doesn't really matter where you have a child on that spectrum. Hopefully today we'll be able to address your child's particular concerns. We are going to focus on understanding the development of racial and ethnic identity. I'm going to talk a little bit about some other social indicators and the ways that they are being developed in our environment. But this is definitely going to be a race-based conversation because, as Katie has already introed, we are having a lot of race-based conversations, and we have caregivers, families that are reaching out saying, how do I in fact talk to my child about race? And how do I in fact talk to my child about racism? And then we'll talk about some activities to support. And then at the end, we're going to take some questions from y'all so we can make sure that you leave feeling like I have some next steps of what to do. So the first thing I have are some stop and think questions, and they come from a book, Anti-Bias Education for Young Children and Ourselves. The authors of the book is Louise Dermott Sparks and Julie Olson Edwards, and they are really the creators of the anti-bias education framework. And I love for us just to kind of stop and reflect, because oftentimes we want to do this work for our children. And when we have to really stop to say, I'm going to do this work with my child, meaning that I also have to do the work on myself as well. So the first question I have is, what is your earliest memory of noticing people with different skin tones, eye shapes, hair texture, and hair color? And did any adult help you think about racial differences? And so if you feel empowered to put it in the chat box if you want. Maybe you're thinking and you're like, I can't really remember, I can't pinpoint it. Or for some of us, we have a distinct memory. And we also oftentimes remember the reaction of the adult in our life. And just jot that down and hold on to that for a second. The next question is, what messages did you receive or did you get either directly or indirectly from your family? It could be your faith-based community, media, school, any outside component. What messages did you get about differences, about skin color, about eye shape, hair texture? And know that silence is a message as well. Then our last one is, as a child, what did you learn by talking about those differences? And how do you feel talking about them today? I ask these questions because we're going to get into what the research tells us is that young children, in fact, notice differences very, very early on. And I won't give you a spoiler alert just yet about how early on, but very, very early on, they notice differences. And as they become more verbal with their expression, 3, 4 years old, they start to then express these differences because they're curious and they're trying to figure out their world around them. By figuring out other people helps them to figure out who I am by who I'm not, right? And oftentimes when we were young and we mentioned differences, we were either met with silence, we were met with shushes, we were met with someone saying, we don't talk like that, or we're all friends, be nice. And that we then internalize those feelings. If I did something wrong, maybe I was bad, or I said something that was bad, we felt guilty. Or what we may have learned was what I said was right, but it's not to be said out loud. It's not to be said in public, but maybe just around the dinner table. And so I want you to stop and think, if you're an adult in your child's life, do you want to be an adult that helps your young child to think about differences, to accept and embrace differences, to love who they are, and also equally love how someone else shows up in the world as well? To be able to say that I believe you are you, I trust that you are you, I love that you are you, and you have every right to be here in this world, sharing space with me too. And so that's the first part of engaging in anti-bias work at home, is you have to be able to say, I want to be an adult in my child's life that helps them to think about differences in a healthy, developmentally appropriate way, but I'm not going to shy away from it. And most importantly, I don't want my child to leave the conversation feeling guilty or ashamed for really just asking a question. If you want to know more, again, this book, Anti-Bias Education for Young Children and Ourselves, is a great book. It is geared towards educators, particularly early childhood preschool educators, but there's a lot of solid information in there if you're into books. The next thing I want to talk about is a little bit about language. And again, we're going to really center the conversation around race today. And I notice a lot of times when I have these conversations that race and ethnicity are oftentimes conflated, and they're really two different words and they're not synonyms. So we're going to talk about race first. Race is a social construction. Okay, race is completely made up. It's a political, economic, and social construction, and there's no science that backs race. There's no biological differences. So when people say there's only one human race, that really means there's only one human species. We don't have subspecies. There's no one that is inferior to another one at all. Over time, the way that we have categorized race has changed, and race is fluid. It's not static in ways that oftentimes we were taught in school. Race is fluid, and it depends where you live in the world for how people categorize race. Right now in the United States, according to the US Census, we have 5 categories for race. We have Black and African American, we have American Indian and Alaska Native. And I've heard from the Indigenous community that they do prefer the term Native American or Indigenous, but this is the way that the US Census does code it. We have Asian, Native, Hawaiian, and other Pacific Islander, and white. The easiest way for me to describe race is the race is your racialized identity. It's the way you present to the world. But it doesn't always make sense in your heart, and it may not be how you feel, how you want to be identified, right? Race oftentimes is just an easy way for us to categorize people, for us to make assumptions, and for us to collect data. Again, that doesn't mean that there's truth or accuracy in race. And the reason why we talk about race is because we do have race-based outcomes in the United States. And then you have ethnicity. Oh, and oftentimes, as someone probably in the chat box right now is saying, what about Hispanic? And I'm glad someone brought that up. So Hispanic is not considered a race. It's actually considered an ethnicity, because you can be of Hispanic descent and be of any racialized category, which is why when you fill out an application, you'll see it will say Hispanic white or Hispanic non-white. So they're trying to figure out your ethnicity and your race. So then you have ethnicity, and ethnicity is much more real. It's your cultural, national, racial group. There's things that overlap. It has to do with your language, your religion, the clothing, the food that you eat, where your ancestors are from. You could have 2 people of the same race, but of different ethnicities. So you could have 2 people that have, like, for instance, are racially Black, but one may be African American or Black American, and another one maybe is African Caribbean or an Afro Latino. And so they don't always match up, and sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So you and your child, in fact, have both. You have a racialized identity and you have an ethnicity. I was just in a conversation with someone the other day, and they had a question. They said, well, if I'm Italian, where is that? And I said, well, Italian could be your ethnicity. Italian could be your nationality, what's stamped on your birth certificate. But Italian is not your racialized identity. You might be a white Italian if you present as a white Italian, but you could also be a Black Italian. So it just depends. You'd have to know your own history, what your birth certificate says, your family, and what connection you have. So I have a quick activity for us to do, and it's called How Diverse is Your Universe? There's a great book that just came out a couple months ago. It's called Don't Look Away, Embracing Anti-Bias in Our Classrooms. And again, this is a classroom-based book, but they have a very similar activity in here, and they call it Lemon Heads, and it's another candy. I forget what it's called. And so in this activity, if you have a sheet of paper or maybe even in your sticky notes on your laptop, we're going to complete this. First, I need you to think about what is your racialized identity. Again, going back to those 5 racialized identities here in the United States. Again, if you're somewhere else international and you're joining us, you'll have to find out what are your racialized categories because they are fluid. So you decide what is your racialized identity. For me, I'll use mine as an example. My racialized identity is Black. And so I'm going to put Black right here. And then my partner, I'll put his racialized identity. My partner is Black. And then my children is or are. So right now I'll have you identify your children, and later on we're going to talk about why it's really important for your children eventually to self-identify how they see themselves, because we all get to self-identify. No one has the right to identify you, but for the purpose of this activity, you can identify your children. And then you start to think, my children's elementary school is predominantly, so think about their peers. My children's teachers are mostly, and if your children are in early childhood and preschool, and so there's a lead teacher and an assistant teacher, think about, is there a racial hierarchy at play, even in the classroom? Is there a racial hierarchy in play between the salaried teachers and maybe the support staff? So it could be bus drivers, sub-tran drivers, cafeteria workers, crossing guards, and folks who receive benefits and salaries. Most of my children's close friends are. When we think of close friends, we typically think of the children that are coming into our home, that we're having play dates with, that we communicate with the families, that we invite them to, they have continued relationships. Most of my close friends are. My doctor is. My children's play dates are with children who are. And so play dates are ones that we're going outside of the home instead of coming into the home. People who regularly visit my home are, and my neighbors are. And think about just, again, predominantly. So if you're able to count a group of people, we know that they then are a minority within that community. And this is just to give you, to allow you to take stock of how diverse, in fact, is your universe. How diverse have you prepared your community to be with your child so that they can, in fact, embrace differences? Or are they only having very superficial or artificial relationship with, let's say, maybe just through books or through media, through television, or something that's more constructed, let's say, if your child goes to a magnet school or a choice school. And so the school district has really, by design, is trying to create an integrated life. If anyone has any ahas about that one, or like, oh, I hadn't really thought about it. If anyone ever also Googles how integrated is the United States, I think you'll be quite shocked at the lack of integration we have across the United States. Myself, again, I'm based in Houston, Texas, and Houston, Texas is one of the most racially and ethnically diverse cities in the United States. And we're also one of the most racially segregated cities in the United States. And you can go into our zoned public schools and see that segregation is very prevalent. So then the next thing I want us to talk a little bit about is just young children and what in fact are they noticing? Going back to what is your earliest memory of noticing people of different skin tones, eye shapes, hair texture, and hair color. And we oftentimes think that young children aren't noticing other people, that somehow people are presenting as either a mirrored image or they're presenting as being transparent or translucent. And we say children don't see color. When we know, in fact, we ask very young children all the time to categorize things. We ask them to categorize things by colors, by shapes. We might have them match socks together. We might give them an odd amount of buttons and say, can you sort these? And we watch how they sort them. We have them sort letters and sounds. So we ask young children all the time, because it's really healthy brain development, categorize. So when they see us, they are also categorizing. And they're having really healthy brain development, and they're noticing, they're curious, they're aware, and they're absorbing. We know that very young children, 0 to 6, in Montessori, we call that the absorbent mind, the absorbent stage, because they're like a sponge, right? They're just absorbing all of these things, and they're drawing conclusions either accurately or inaccurately about what they're noticing. The next one is 3s and 4s. I'm hoping everyone has a chance just to kind of go through and have a chance to see this. But the next one is 3s and 4s. Again, we have gender and sex identity. There's differences and similarities, physical difference and similarities, racial differences and similarities, and cultural differences and similarities. I'll give you all about 15 more seconds just to read through it. And so what's really important is at 3 and 4, because now they're more verbally expressive and they're wondering and they're curious, this is where now the curiosity comes out and they start to ask questions. They want to know, is my skin color going to change? Will it get darker? Will it change to my daddy color or my mommy color? And this is a really great age that we want to make sure that we are not instilling a sense of guilt or shame in our young children, but we are also responding with curiosity. You know, if someone says, if your young child says, is my skin color going to get darker? And I'm like, you respond with, darker like what? So really having just that back and forth of trying to help them understand, and also you not jumping to assumptions or conclusions and being like, oh my gosh, my child doesn't like their skin color. That might not be it. Maybe there's someone that they admire that has a darker skin color, or they're literally just curious, like, how did I get this skin color? The next one we have is 5s. And something else I wanted to mention about skin colors in anti-bias education in 0 to 6 is we don't have the conversation about racism. We do have the conversation about skin tones. So when a child is about 6 or 7 is when we can start to introduce the conversation around race, because that is a social construct. We also need to give our young children the historical conversation, the historical context of how in fact was race created here in the United States. Again, race was created to divide people. Race was created for a social, political, and economic advantage for some and disadvantaged for others. And so a child really needs to be around 6 or 7 before you engage in that conversation. That's not to say though, and again, we're going to do some research here, I think on my next slide. Nope, not yet. It's not to say though that young children will say things that are inaccurate. They might say something like, a very common statement is, you know, maybe you drank too much chocolate milk and that's why you're darker. Or maybe God was angry when he made you and that's why you're darker. And so just because we're not going to have that hard conversation about racism and what that is, doesn't mean that we can't correct. And we can't say, actually, their skin color is darker because they have more melanin than you. Everyone has melanin. Some have more melanin than others. And your ancestors or your family will tell you how much melanin you're going to have. So we can't correct it, we can interrupt it, and we can help them draw an accurate conclusion. And a young child is like, oh, okay. And we can move on from there. So we have 4 goals of anti-bias education. And so for my families, my parents, my caregivers, these are 4 goals that we want to try and instill in our child in our home, but also in their school setting, their faith-based community, any other community that they're a part of. We want our young children to gain a self-awareness, confidence and pride in themselves, and self-love. That's the first goal, and we spend the most time right there. The next goal is we want them to embrace and celebrate differences and develop accurate language to understand diversity. From there, we want them to identify unfairness and bias, have language to describe inequity. With young children, we use the word unfair, and understand that bias hurts. And then our last one is be empowered to advocate against prejudice and bias. Again, these are developed by Louise Thurman Sparks and Julie Olson Edwards. And this work has been around for, a handful of years now, really since the 1980s. So now we're going to talk about, okay, we understand that. How are we going to make it more practical? There's this video by Sesame Street. If you're a Sesame Street fan, put it in the chat box. I'm a huge Sesame Street fan. And they have so many great videos. We're not going to watch this one today, but this one here, they're talking about skin tone. And you have Elmo, who's affirming his fur, and you have Lupita, who's affirming her skin tone and saying that she loves her brown skin tone. So we think about, my child has many identities. They have personal identities, which is like their name, their age, their personality, their likes, their dislikes, their interests, their hobbies. They also have social identities, even from a very young age. They have a racialized identity. They have a gender. They possibly will have a religious or spiritual affiliation. You may not have one, but they have a socioeconomic status. They have all of these also social identities that we have to also think about how, in fact, can we make sure our young children have confidence and pride in who they are and their family. We want our young children to embrace and celebrate differences. So we do that by start talking about ourselves, and our young children will start talking about themselves, right? And when they start talking about themselves, they're going to also ask their friends about themselves. So we get people talking about themselves with each other, and that's how you can share accurate language with one another. We read books. Again, there's Dr. Rudim Sims Bishops who coined that term, windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors. We need books that are windows for ourselves. I think of this book here, Anna and Andrew by Christine Platt. This book is a mirror for my child, Kobe, who's 7. He gets to see himself in this book and be affirmed. But this child might be a window for Katie's children, which Katie's children get to watch and read a book that's going to be able to watch somebody else's experience. And sliding glass doors is a little bit of both. It's important though, as we read, as we're selecting books, that we're also looking at who's the author, who's profiting, because this goes into some more of advocating work, but who's profiting off the story? Are they of the said community? Because we know if someone's of the said community, they're more likely to use accurate language. Listen to music from different cultures. If you have a Spotify or a Tidal account, browse through and see how much music from other cultures, again, of the said community that you're listening to. Also think about providing dolls and figurines, Black people with different skin tones and features in your household. I don't know if I can easily access, I have some materials here. You can purchase these skin tone art supplies. And so there's these faces and they have different skin tones. As they read books, they can say, can you draw a picture of the main character? They have also this crinkly hair. I don't know if y'all can see this crinkly hair, and it's of different hair color. They have colored stickers for different colored eyes. And so again, we're raising awareness, we're giving them language. So it's really important to provide diverse drawing materials to your young children. There is, let's see if I can grab it here. There's these skin tone crayons that you can purchase that have just an array of skin tone, and you can have them match their skin tone. Can you find your skin tone? Can you find your friend's skin tone? Can you find the skin tone of the main character? Here's an example of things that I always recommend, not just educators to have in their classroom, but caregivers can have in their home as well. The next one is identify unfairness and bias and have language to describe inequity and understand that bias hurts. Look, 3 to 6 year olds do an incredible job with calling us out as adults and saying something isn't right. They are truth tellers. They tell the truth. And so they oftentimes will ask questions. Why do they live underneath the bridge? Why do people need money to, why do people need help to buy food? They want to know why. The biggest takeaway for this one is in anti-bias education, we always system blame instead of person blame. And I'll give you an example. So why do they live under the bridge was a big question we had actually from our 8-year-old when we first moved to Houston. And instead of trying to come up with like all of these very individual explanations, it's as simple as, well, Houston doesn't have enough affordable housing. You know, Houston doesn't invest in affordable housing. And so people can't afford to, you know, rent an apartment, to purchase a home. And that way it's going to help us in the next goal of, okay, what can we do? How can we advocate? Same thing with why do people need help to buy food? Well, you know what? In Houston, in the state of Texas, we don't have a livable wage. You may live in a community that has a livable wage, but here in Houston, we don't have a livable wage. And so people have to make tough decisions of how to spend their money. Or why do I have to cut my hair? Is that maybe another big question. This one here isn't necessarily a system blame. Why do I have to cut my hair? That might be a question that you have to ask yourself of, why am I asking my child to cut their hair? And gosh, am I asking my child to cut their hair because of my own preference? Am I asking my child to cut their hair because their hair is in their eyes and their teacher's complaining that they can't see the board? Am I asking my child to cut their hair because of maintenance? But some of these we have to really also respond with, I don't know. Can I get back to you on that? Or, okay, I'm going to write it down. I'm going to think about it. I'm going to set an alarm and I'm going to come back to you tomorrow and respond to you. And that is a really big lesson for our young learners, to approach this with humility and to be able to say, I'm going to research that. I'll come back to you. Okay. And then the last one is be empowered to advocate against prejudice and injustice. And again, this can be either individually or collectively that they can do it. Going back to the last example of, well, Houston doesn't have enough affordable housing. A young child might say, well, why not? Or what can we do about it? We can say, well, I can vote for better policies. We can write our mayor. We can write the city council. We could support our local community efforts, Habitat for Humanity, people that are building houses. So there's lots of things when we're system blamed that a young child then can turn around and say, we can help out. There's thrift stores that offer vouchers for people who recently got a house, and so they need help furnishing the house. So we can say, you know what, let's purchase some things we can donate to the thrift store. Or we can, if we just received, let's say, some new dishware, and our dishware before is perfectly fine. Okay, well, let's make sure we're going to donate that to the thrift store because this is a collective action. We're being community. Some other things you can do to make sure that your young children, that we're instilling that sense of advocacy, is making sure our young children, especially our girls, are able to say, stop it. As caregivers, we also need to model this. This is a big one I see on the playground. When pushing happens, shoving happens, someone's trying to take someone's turn, making sure our young children know how to say, please don't take my turn, right? You may go when my turn is done. That's a big one that we worked with our young one, of when he went to go down the slide. I would notice that girls in particular would try to go in front, and other parents would let the girls go in front, like, oh, let the girl go first. And in our household, we don't have that rule. We have the rule of you may go when it is your turn, and really instilling that sense of we can all share the slide. Again, pushing is happening, shoving is happening. They're throwing mulch, they're throwing sand because they're having a great time, and they're not trying to cause harm to anyone. They literally are having a great time. And it's okay then to remind the children, we have a safety rule, and have them remind each other, hey, we don't throw sand because we have a safety rule. And then another one oftentimes we'll hear, let's say it's Mother's Day or Father's Day actually is coming up here. And I need to figure out what we're doing for Father's Day, but Father's Day is coming up here. And someone might want to, and a child might want to make 2 Father's Day cards. Maybe they have a stepfather, maybe they have a biological father, maybe they have an adopted father, maybe they are a family where they have 2 dads, whatever reason we have 2 fathers. And a child might say, that's not fair. You can't make 2 Father Days cards. And we all get to be different. It's a great way to respond, to advocate against that pre-prejudice that could be developing, and continue to encourage our young children to solve a community issue, something that is local, happening in a community. And we've seen that with the beautiful stories coming out of the Black Lives Matter protest, and children making posters. We actually just saw one on the way home today in the window. We've seen children going out and they're marching, they're creating their own marches in their neighborhood, going around shouting Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. So encourage them continue to solve a problem together. So just to recap, at home, we want our children to have self-love. We want them to be able to embrace differences. We want them to be able to recognize unfairness and advocate against it. Katie, how are we doing on time? I can't.
We're okay. We have 10 more minutes, or we can go a little bit longer if we end up going a couple minutes over. That's totally fine. So we're good right now. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So some things that families can do at home. This comes from an article from Teaching Young Children to Resist Bias. You could Google that article and it'll pop right up. But some things you can do at home right now today is that you can recognize that we do live in a biased society. We live in a society where many biases exist, and that is not just around race and ethnicity, it's also around language, it's around socioeconomic class, it's around gender, it's around ability. Right now, you can provide multiple messages through books and dolls and toys and wall decorations that are disrupting stereotypes. Making sure, going back to that, how diverse is my universe, show no bias in friendships, in doctors, teachers, and other service providers, that you have the opportunity to choose. Knowing, I understand, especially with the healthcare, sometimes we're locked into a health insurance plan. but be mindful of what is the society, your community that you're preparing. And think about the stores where you shop. Katie already had said, it's Juneteenth today. So intentionally think about, we went to our local Black-owned coffee shop and the line was out the door. Think about shopping at Black-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses as well. Make a firm rule that a person's appearance is never acceptable reason to tease or reject them. And that goes beyond just what they're wearing, but how they look, how they sound, if they have a different vernacular or dialect in a way. And immediately step in when you hear your child behave in such a way. And notice I said, when you hear, because you will hear, if we're really, really listening, our children have drawn conclusions. And they have watched teasing happen in media. They've watched teasing happen with other friends. So when you hear it, immediately step in and interrupt it. And not just with children, but also with adults as well. Continue to affirm your child's personal and social identities, provide opportunities for them to interact with other children. Thinking about the playgrounds, we have a great playground. We have a few here in Houston, but one in particular is created specifically for children who have disabilities, disabled children. And that playground is open to all. So think about ways in which you can have your young children interact and sustain relationships with differences. Respectfully listen to your children, answer their questions, don't ignore it, don't change the subject, and also don't make your child feel bad for the way that they're asking the question. And a great way to know if you did is just ask them, how did you feel? How did I make you feel when I responded to your question? Children are truth tellers, they will tell you. And teach children how to challenge biases about who they are and give them tools to confront those who act biased against them. And I'll give you a quick example of our 13-year-old. When coronavirus had first hit the United States, I knew, in fact, that there was going to be, he's in middle school, I knew, in fact, that there was going to be a lot of anti-Asian racism that was happening, even though it's a very small population at his school. And so Teaching Tolerance has a great free document called Speak Up at School. And they help educators, but you can help your child 4 ways of how to interrupt. And so I gave them some examples, gave them tools, and then we role played and practiced. How would you interrupt? How would you question? How would you respond to, or who would you report to when you hear anti-Asian racism as well? Okay, I know that was a lot, and I think we have some questions.
We sure do. Okay, and actually, Britt, I'm just to the community, I'll connect back with you and get like the names of all the titles that you kind of highlighted during this conversation. We can email that out to everyone after the fact for anyone who wants to reading on their own. And then also, are you able to share the slides? I probably should have asked you this before. We're getting a lot of questions. Just people this will be recorded and they can rewatch, but for people who want to like maybe do the work and print it out and that's
you know what I'll do is how about if I share the slides on my platform and it will be open sourced? Is that okay? And I'll share the link for where I will share those slides, but I will get to you, Katie, the book recommendations that I made and also some links to where they can purchase the materials for the Mom Project for easy access.
Great, thank you. Sorry. Yeah, there's a lot of interest in reading up and obviously
it's a whole new world.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Yeah, thank you to the community. You guys submitted a lot of really great questions as part of your RSVPs for today's session. So we'll try to get to as many as we can. There are a lot of them that would require an hour just to get started on the very tip of the iceberg. So we'll get into a couple right now. And I think a lot of people that RSVP today seems like they've heard of Britt and have been following for a while, but we saw a few questions about how your work, Britt, you've spoken a lot about language in the past. Can you highlight particular mistakes that you see parents unknowingly doing when it comes to using different words or phrases?
Yeah, so some of it I've already kind of touched over during the presentation. Number one mistake oftentimes is the silence, is by not actually engaging in any of the language. And the silence it speaks volume. And so making sure that you respond in some way, even if you just respond back with curiosity, with a question, or you respond back with humility to say, that was such a good question and I can't wait to tell you the answer tomorrow, and follow back up with them. Again, person blaming, when children are having questions, unless you know the said person specific history and all of the ins and outs, do not try and respond by saying, well, there's some people and then these people and then that people and then maybe that person, but continue to system blame so that your child, you can then work in goal number 4 of advocating. How can we fix it? Another one, sometimes there's this hyper focus on positivity and kindness. And in our household, we're creating what's called a brave space versus a safe space. And in a brave space, that means that we have a hyper focus on truth and justice. And so knowing that truth is a gift, it's a gift of love. When someone gives you the truth, they care enough about you, and to receive that. I think about the difference. I think about going to Chick-fil-A. We are here in Texas, and Chick-fil-A is huge here. And if you've ever been to a Chick-fil-A, you'll know that it is full of kindness there. You go through the drive-thru and they're like, welcome to Chick-fil-A. It's a beautiful day. It's 89 degrees. And it's just so much kindness. But in the values of the business, it is not justice at all. And so making sure we're always emphasizing, is what my child saying the truth? Is it accurate? And is it focused on justice? And if so, we're going to move through with that. Be specific about your language. If you're talking about race, say I'm talking about race, people will say, oh, I want my child to have diversity or experience diversity. And I'm like, socioeconomic diversity, racial diversity, gender diversity. So be really specific. Model asking people, how do you identify? Sometimes people are like, I don't know how they, just model, asking, how do you identify racially? Model asking, could you remind me your pronouns again? My pronouns are she, her. What are your pronouns? So modeling that one, and just honestly having a sense of curiosity about language and welcoming new words, because it just opens our minds and hearts, right? And language itself is a social construction, so it doesn't have to be fixed. It can be as fluid as we want it to be.
All really powerful things. And I think, you feel like you're doing a good job, but then, there's always more that you can be doing on top of this.
Yeah, I love that you said that, Katie, because I'm going to share too, becoming anti-bias, anti-racist is a journey. It is never a destination. And like Katie said, we're all doing great things, and there's always things we can do more. It is a verb. It's something we do. It is not a noun. It's not who I am, but it's who I'm trying to become. And so I love that you said that. Kind of goes along with even the word ally, right? An ally is not a noun. It's not something that's static or fixed, but it's something that's dynamic. And in every decision that I make, I can choose to be an ally, or I can choose to be complicit in a situation.
So the next question we had was, do you have any advice on preparing our kids to have tough conversations with grandparents, teachers, or authority figures who may make racist or biased comments?
Yes. Okay, so one big thing is making sure that you have the same working definition of what is racist and biased. And so making sure your family has a definition to be able to identify what in fact is racist. I use a definition from Dave Wellman. Racism is a system of advantage where white people are advantaged and people of color are disadvantaged. Again, it puts the onus on systems that's institutionalized and through policies. A lot of anti-racist folks, and the most commonly accepted definition among anti-racist folks, is personal prejudice and the misuse of power. And so it's the way, it's my beliefs, it's my prejudice, and then how I hold power that I'm able to enact those beliefs on one another. And so the reason why I use the system advantage is because it has to be, in order for something to be racist, then it has to be in fact a white person that's enacting their power. It can't be a person of color, right? So a person of color can't be racist, but they can have discriminatory actions. And this is where I think sometimes people are like, oh gosh, the language, it's so much. So making sure you have a working definition for what is racism, a working definition for what is bias. Bias and prejudice are synonyms, so you could use those interchangeably. And then once you have that, some ways to, when young children, they're going to play, I'll use the word play, they're trying out that word racist. Particularly around 4th grade on up, you'll start to see young children use the word "that's racist," that kind of phrase. And they're practicing calling out discrimination, and they're also practicing calling out meanness. And so some ways that you can respond, again, I'm sure everyone's going to guess curiosity right there. And being able to say, if it is racist and you believe your child, agree with them. Yes, I agree. Right next to them in front of Pawpaw, right in front of Nana, and be like, I do think that's racist. But really challenge your child to say, how is that prejudice and power? Or can you identify who's benefiting from a system or supporting the system? So really support the learner to think critically as they're calling someone out, and also ask them, what could we do? Or what do you want to see changed? Like, what do you want to see Pawpaw say differently or do differently? If it's not racist, affirm the learner and saying, I see that, or affirm your child saying, I see you're trying to, you're looking for and you're investigating racism. But if it's meanness, you should just say, no, that person is just being mean. Like, that just was unkind, or that was rude. But what made you think it was racist? Could you tell me more? Could you tell me about his system? Reminding our young children, but also reminding us adults, that being called racist is not a slur. It's not a name call. It's not something for you to feel bad about. Being called racist is really identifying a person who has been given the privilege or the immunity and to benefit from, and they're misusing that. And so if it's meanness, call it meanness. If it's not, if it is racism, or if it's something else, if it's really sexism, say, oh, it sounds like you're talking about the system of where men are benefiting from a system versus other people. I was going to say women, but it could also be non-binary folks and what have you, is a big one. Some other things I wanted to say is, going back to my example with Carter, make a plan, role play, practice. It's so hard oftentimes for even adults for us to call each other in. So practice that with our young children, give them tools to interrupt. How do we interrupt a joke? If you hear a joke, if you're around the dinner table and y'all got together for monthly birthdays and someone says a racist joke, practice with your child that a way that we interrupt that is by questioning, could you explain that joke to me? And that really kills the joke. Like, everyone's like, it's not that funny, is it? Make sure you support your child when they are interrupting right there. And you just kind of what Katie's doing right now, you just nod, right? And if people don't want to hear what your child has to say, then amplify what your child is saying and say, you know what, I would like my child to repeat what they're saying. I trust my child. I believe my child. What could we do differently? Focus on not just calling it out, but focus on also the action of what do we want to see changed.
Yeah, I think that's important. I think it's great. And I think even, a lot of adults are still learning how to be like, hold up, like, stop right there. But also what outcomes beyond just that, you know what I mean?
Exactly. Like, what do you want to see their language change? Did you want an apology? Sometimes it's like, we just want it to be known that there's no tolerance. We have zero intolerance in this house, that's not going to live or breathe. A big thing that I try to get across is, speaking the truth just means that you're ready to solve the problem. But speaking the truth doesn't mean that you're the cause of it. And someone who pushes back against that just means they're not ready to reckon with the truth. And so that's really, really powerful. It's just, I'm saying the truth too, because I'm ready to solve the problem. I didn't create the problem. You maybe didn't create it, but you're definitely perpetuating it, but we could change it.
Yeah, that's a really great way to kind of phrase it to people who might otherwise just shut down. So I like that a lot.
Yeah.
Okay. The next question was, and this is something I'm sure you could go on and on considering this is your wheelhouse, but how can we support anti-racist policies in education?
Yes.
Whole wide world. Yeah.
This is my wheelhouse. Okay, so how can we support anti-racist policies in education? A really big one is for parents and caregivers. Really demand your school and your school district to have anti-bias, anti-racist training for all faculty and staff. So anyone who comes in contact with your child who's going to say good morning or or have a good day, demand that they will be trained. And it's really important that it's anti-bias, anti-racist training and not a diversity training, not a multiculturalism training, because those trainings just say we're trying to get people who look different together, but those trainings do not go into inclusion. And how do we actually, once we get people together, how do we make sure everyone feels safe, everyone feels brave, everyone is welcomed, and everybody wants to stay in that space? So make sure that training is about seeking to build an awareness, and then also that there's some action next steps with that too. You can advocate, or you can create a racial justice committee. I'm going to say racial justice because this one is a race-based conversation, but it could be any type of justice committee. You just need a really small group of passionate folks who want to push policies forward. The Justice Committee is not the same as the book club. Okay, the Justice Committee is saying we all acknowledge, in fact, we live in a racist, biased society, and we all want to be a part of that change. They feel really hot and fired up about it. And so start that committee. Your book club or your kind of community building can be something else. You can have a community building, ask your school if, hey, can we start a community building group that can focus on folks getting to know each other, reading a book, like So You Want to Talk About Race, or Becoming Anti-Racist, or Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? It can be a place where you do a community potluck, of course, when it is safe, not COVID time. But that's where you might have people who are warm or even cold. And I usually call warm people usually are just unconscious, and cold people are resistant. That is not who you want on your justice committee, because that means you're only going to work at the pace of your most resistant person, which means no work is getting done, right? So vote, things that you can do individually, vote to fund public schools. That's a big one. Don't vote to close brown and black schools in your local community. Advocate for school choice instead of zone schooling, because again, school choice and magnet schools will allow for integration to happen in your schools. Zone schooling is going to allow for the continued segregation that we already have based off what zip code you can afford. Demand that your PTO share their financial resources with other poor schools that are raising less money. Again, if you live in a poor school district, a poor zip code, and so that means their PTO is going to be able to, their funds are correlated to property, right? So share your PTO money, donate that, redistribute that to other schools. You can also think about, if your school doesn't have a lot of Black teachers, think about ways that you can start a teacher training pipeline with your school district and a fellow HBCU, or if it's a predominantly white institution, their Black student union. Again, that's really working to empower Black educators. And when we think about the word empowerment, we think of it in two parts. One, I trust you to do the very best you can do, and I will give you the resources you need to do your best. And that itself is empowerment. So if there's fees that are in the way, that maybe we could do a t-shirt drive to raise money so that teachers can pay their fees for basic skills or content. But start the conversation with admin. Think about ways that parents and caregivers and the community can together come up with a justice community, also build community, invest in public schools, and think about the ways in which you're voting and how your vote is going to impact the most marginalized.
I mean, when you lay it out like that, like we all have tools that you could go and leverage right now to make an impact. It's just reframing what you're prioritizing and thinking about. So that's really, really powerful. That kind of rounds up kind of some of the submitted questions we had. I did see a couple interesting questions pop up in the chat, just about, particularly for maybe some of the younger kids, like in terms of like starting these anti-racist, anti-bias conversations, how much of like current events to like pull into those conversations with kids that are maybe on the younger end of the spectrum. I know you said, a little bit like a lot of that, like more kind of detailed pieces shouldn't come out till they're like 6 or 7, but there were a lot of questions about that. Like, they're taking their kids to rallies and protests right now. How to kind of talk about it with younger kids.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and share just my contact screen, my final slide as I respond to that one, because I know people are going to hop off soon, but that is a really good question. And so we might go over a couple of minutes on time, but that's a super important question. Number one is there's no hard or fast rule for that. You have to know your child. You have to know where they're at with their self-esteem, how they're feeling about themselves, how they feel about their identity. You also have to know how sensitive your young, when I say young children, I'm talking about children 6 and younger. Ways in which we do talk about, and I will give my example of how I talked to our 7-year-old about George Floyd, is I first showed him a picture of George Floyd in his football uniform. And I said, do you know who this is? And Kobe said, I don't know. And I said, well, his name is George Floyd. And I said, what can you tell by looking at the picture? And he said, well, he likes football. I said, he does. And Kobe had said, I think he's dead. And I said, why do you think he's dead? And Kobe said, the picture's in black and white, so it must be really old, right? So like I'm starting to draw some conclusions where he's at. And I said, oh, well, actually the picture just happened to be in black and white, but he's pretty young. And I said, he likes football. He's actually here from Houston. He went to high school in 3rd Ward. We've been there before. And Kobe's like, okay. And I said, and I want to tell you something has happened to him. And Kobe already knew because we have had conversations, and he said, did the police murder him? And I said, they did. They did murder him. And so right now what's happening is you have people that are mobilizing and resisting and protesting the brutality in which Black men experience from the police. And so I had offered Kobe if he wanted to, I always offer some type of art. Do you want to make a card, or do you want to draw a picture? And Kobe's like, no, I'm going to go back to my book, Who Would Win? And we move on from that. So when we do introduce it to young children, we want to focus on the individual in which the oppression they experience, that we humanize that story as much as possible. And we keep the blame on the system, right? There's nothing in that situation that George Floyd did wrong. And quite frankly, in any of the other cases, whether it is Mike Brown or Philando Castile, there's nothing in that situation those people did wrong. Right? We continue to blame the system in the ways that the system has failed us and the ways the system can improve. So that's really important. It is also equally important that you spend the bulk of your time, if you haven't already, affirming your child's identity. Start with goals 1 and 2. Again, so that their first experience, if I'm speaking to a white person right now, and your child has had a limited experience with Black folks, we do not want their first experience to be this cycle again of oppression. And we've had this story now for 400 years of the only times we talk about or know about Black people is when they're experiencing oppression. It's so important that young children and us as adults, we understand that every single person, Black people included, come from a place of power before we talk about the oppression in which they experience. So you don't really have to get into any of the hard details. You don't need to get into the details about how he was murdered. We need to identify the unfairness and recognize that hurt. And in George Floyd's case, and the other people that you had mentioned, Nina Pop and Tony McDade, the ultimate hurt, right, with their life. And then how can we in fact advocate, and what can we do about it? Hopefully that was helpful to the community just to understand how to have the conversation and move forward.
Amazing. Thank you, Britt. We so appreciate your time and energy and insight and expertise on all of this. If you can't see it, it's up on the screen, but please support Britt on her Patreon. You can continue to learn there and unlock additional resources. follow her on social. Yeah, I mean, this was 60 minutes. I mean, you can't cover that much in this amount of time. So we hope, regardless of where, all of you out there that are tuned in today, wherever you are on your path, whether anti-racist or anti-bias conversations are already happening in your home, or if you're just, starting to kind of build your path, we hope that, this has really helped you to just stay on a path of continued learning and kind of, helping you continue to push for justice. But yeah, no, thank you. Just a quick housekeeping update that I'm actually going out on maternity leave, so you won't be seeing my face on Unity Hours for a little while here, but you will see Colleen and my colleague Hiba. She actually heads up all of our incredible social. So she'll be leading these sessions as well over the course of the next few months. Really excited for that. And then just as always, we are here to support all of you. So please, please, please feel free to reach out to us with any topics you would like to, have us cover during these sessions, or suggestions of what we could be doing better, people you'd like to hear from. We want to hear your voices and reflect that in the programming we offer here on these sessions. So feel free to drop us an email at community@themomproject at any time, and we will certainly respond to you. Again, we're all doing this together. So thank you. And thank you again, Britt. This was really, really helpful.
A big thanks to the Mom Project community for having me, engaging in the conversation, and thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Britt. We'll talk soon.
Bye, everyone.